burnout is like a warning sign. It's like a red flag warning. The warning is about the environment. Environment is the thing that we have not been paying as much attention to. Despite years of research and all of this kind of thing, people always are focusing on self-care, what's wrong with the person. It's a good thing to help people cope with stressors, figure out better ways to take care of themselves and so forth. But that doesn't mean that the problem lies within them. Why is it happening in the first place? What is the environment surrounding people? And how do we better understand that as well as what's happening to them?
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. Dr. Christina Maslach is on a mission to redefine how we tackle burnout at work. For over 35 years, Dr. Maslach has researched the far-reaching costs of burnout. She believes that burnout is an employer's problem and has dedicated her career to researching the definition, predictors, and measurement of job burnout, as well as the best solutions. Christina is the creator of the Maslach Burnout Inventory, which is the leading measure of burnout in the workplace. It's been validated by over 35 years of research. She's also the author of numerous award-winning articles and books, including The Cost of Caring, The Truth About Burnout, and most recently, The Burnout Challenge. Her commitment led the World Health Organization to recognize burnout as an occupational phenomenon in 2019, raising the stakes for organizations worldwide. Today, Christina is paving the way for meaningful workplace interventions that help people avoid burnout and be their best at work. In this episode, Christina and I discuss concepts from her latest book, The Burnout Challenge, including the economic and physical impact of burnout, chronic job stressors and solutions, and why leaders should care about employee burnout from both a business and a personal standpoint. We also discuss compassion fatigue, the 6 main causes of burnout, and other topics. All right, if you enjoy this episode, please consider subscribing wherever you listen to podcasts. And now, my conversation with Dr. Christina Maslach. Welcome, Christina Maslach, to Work for Humans.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
You have done, I believe, the most substantial research and work on burnout. And the truth is, it's a word we use all the time, but I don't think it's a word that we necessarily use in a uniform way or in a very specific way. And you've gotten very specific about it. So before I even start diving into it, why should everyone care about burnout?
First of all, let me point out that you're correct in saying that people use burnout for all kinds of things, and we're not all on the same page with the use of it. So more specifically, I've been looking at and talking about job burnout, what is happening in the workplace. People use it for parent burnout, and Pilates burnout and Chardonnay burnout. I mean, it's always used as a word of saying a negative experience. In some cases, it's a sort of synonym for stress, but if it were just stress, and it is a stress response, why would we just change the word for it? But so burnout really actually is an experience that goes beyond stress and has negative implications both for the worker and the workplace. It was a word that, it's not that I invented it or anything like that, but as I started doing early interviews and by accident, by chance, stumbled across this phenomenon, this was the word that people were using to describe their experience. And I would be asking them other kind of questions, is it this kind of thing? Here's this term that I found, that detached concern. Does that, no, dehumanization, no. And then by chance, again, I met someone who said, I used to work in poverty law, and what you're describing sounds like what we called burnout. So then I started using that at the end of the interviews, and after we were all finished, and say, well, I've heard this word, detached concern, no. How about burnout? Yes, that's it. So there was something about the term, the imagery that goes with it, the very sort of vivid notion of there used to be a fire and flames and things happening, and now it's all crumbled and it's no longer there, and there's ashes. And it also kind of captured their sense of what they were going through. It was like flames licking at their heels as they're running to keep ahead of what the things they have to do. And this was back in the 70s that this term kind of resonated. So I decided, because there was such a strong reaction from interviewee after interviewee after interviewee from many different occupations, I thought, there's something here, and this is how they're describing it, and I'll go with, and essentially the language of the people rather than try to come up with a scholarly different sort of thing about it. There have been some people who have claimed that they've invented the term, but no, it was around even way before. It was back, if you look, a Burnt Out Case, a novel by Graham Greene, and if you look at the whole origins of stress and burnout of things that used to work and now don't, have been pushed beyond their capacity. My father was an engineer and did research on rarefied gas, kind of thing. So he was contributed to the space program. And we always would hear as kids, rocket boosters burn out and light bulbs burn out and ball bearings burn out. That notion of something that was functional and now no longer has that capacity to work anymore. It's kind of like given their all and it's gone, has been around for a while. And so who kind of adopted it to this sort of experience, who knows? But I was just always struck by how people got so emotionally involved in this. They got angry and upset as recalling things. They would cry sometimes during the interview. This was something that really meant a lot to these people. And I just sort of kept saying, I've got to keep focusing on this, even though as an early assistant professor without tenure, this was not the way to do the research I had been trained to do to get tenure. I also couldn't get published at first because I think partly it sounded like pop psychology, burnout, as opposed to some grand theory or something. And when I finally published an article, not in a journal, but in a popular magazine called Human Behavior, they did cover art. It was on the cover of the magazine. And in those days of snail mail, it went viral. I got sacks of mail from people all over saying, oh my God, I didn't know I was not the only one. Let me tell you my story, this kind of thing. And it was clear again that there was something going on that was more underground, if you will, because people talked about it as a stigma. That's not something you'd brag about. So it was a liability.
So why should leaders care about it? Is it a problem for businesses?
Yeah, because if you are really trying to get the best return on the investment you make in the employees you hire and want the best quality performance, productivity, whatever it is that they are producing or doing, the services they're giving, you want them to be doing their very best, to be thriving, to be getting better at what they do and, et cetera. If they're doing well, you want to keep them. And if you don't provide a healthy work environment in which people really can grow and thrive and do well and feel good about what they're doing, and instead they're just getting beaten down by those work conditions, then you're not going to get the kind of results you want in your business. And you're going to have turnover problems. You're going to have employee going out on sick leave. You're going to have medical, health expenses. You're going to have a lot of other things that cost a lot. And there's an economic bottom line, but at some level you have to consider that there's a human bottom line there, and how to make sure that it's a good environment in which people can really do well is not something that the individual workers can necessarily control. And so it's really something that is, when you look at the sort of the deep roots of burnout, it's that people are responding to chronic job stressors that have not been successfully managed. And that's a quote from World Health Organization as well. So not been successfully managed is optimistic in the sense of saying it could be successfully managed, but it's really about the leadership then of different companies, organizations, et cetera, to sort of say, how do we make it as good an environment as we possibly can for the people we want to bring in here and do well. The other thing I just want to emphasize is the word chronic, because that's important. Chronic stressors are different from acute stressors. And all the research on stress and coping shows that people do not recover as well from chronic stressors. And these are the things that are there most of the time, all of the time, so no matter what you do, it's there again the next day and, et cetera. And so the stress response, which is part of what burnout is, a response to job stressors, is a normal response. I mean, thank God we all have a stress response when there's threats, or challenges or whatever. The problem is the recovery from that, and it's harder with the chronic ones. So these are often what people call the pebbles in their shoe, the things that are annoying or harmful or just getting in the way, obstacles, and you just have to deal with them all the time. So that's why burnout, back to your original question, is so important, I think, for leadership and companies as well, because you could be losing some of your very best people because they're just getting sour and turned off by what's going on at the work. They can't keep up with it. They're not able to do well. They're taking shortcuts, and then they're not taking pride in their work, and they're not feeling good about what they're able to do, and they may quit and leave. I mean, burnout doesn't happen to the people who can't do the work. Burnout can happen to anybody, and particularly some of your best and your brightest.
Yeah, I think there's some really important pieces in there that I want to flesh out a little bit. One of them is, as an analogy, it makes a lot of sense to me, the idea of burnout, which is that there's something that was there that has been exhausted. It's some kind of fuel. And I know that metaphor is way too concrete for what's really probably going on. You have a book called The Cost of Caring. And it sounds a lot like that was when you first were coming across this and first were identifying it was in professions where caring matters. But when you talk about the best and brightest often being affected by burnout, it also seems to me that oftentimes the people in your company who care the most are the ones who do the best work. And so it might be that really good people are particularly susceptible to burnout.
It's an interesting question in that regard. I mean, I think that the caring, and particularly that I was talking about at that time, was because of the people I had been interviewing who were all these, what we would call first responders these days, during the pandemic, it would be police officers and nurses and doctors and working in the emergency room and dealing with people in crisis in various ways. And part of the caring, this is what some people call compassion fatigue. I mean, you're dealing with very difficult situations and emotions and problems that in other people that are not so far necessarily from you that you can empathize with. Police officers talk about this all the time, that it could be your child, it could be your elderly parent that you come across as a victim or, having a problem with it. So it hits close to home, and it kind of takes an extra kind of thing to deal with it in a way that is professional and trying to, be really clear about what's the best course of action. But it's in a way, it can take a little piece of your heart with you. And I think that's the kind of cost that people were talking about. And then feeling that at times as I burn out, one more person comes by and says, I need your help. I don't have the money to buy, da-da-da-da-da. And you're saying, sorry, I'm gone. I'm home. Call somebody else. You're being rude and abrupt. This is the dehumanization, the cynicism, the negative response to not just the job, but sometimes to your clients, your patients, and so forth. So that's a kind of aspect of the work in that interpersonal way that is not necessarily exactly the same in other kinds of occupations like financial services or tech. Caring about doing the job well, caring about, making something is at another level. It doesn't have that interpersonal bringing you in as though you were part of the problem in the same way.
What are the components? So you created the MBI. What does MBI stand for?
Maslach Burnout Inventory.
What are the components? What does it measure? Because I think a lot of times, like we were saying earlier, a lot of times burnout is used colloquially. But the specific definition of burnout that you describe is a lot more than just being tired.
It is.
What are the components?
The components are three things. And I have to say from the outset that this was not some definition that I just made up in my own head. As a researcher, you go for research and trying to get evidence on it. So when I started developing this measure at the behest of my mentor, who was like Harrison Goff, who was the person who knows about doing psychometric tests on this thing, you may assume it's going to be something that will assess burnout as a single kind of thing, but you have to do a lot of research on the people themselves in these jobs, on their coworkers, on their clients, patients, students, whoever, a 360-degree view, their spouse or their family, and with many hundreds of people in different occupations. So it took years and years to do that and really look at the data and see what was coming out. And what we kept finding over and over again was that if we're taking the statements that people would make in these interviews and stuff like that, and then have other people answer them, that it sort of would break apart into these three interrelated components. One was the exhaustion, which is this ultimate stress response. I can't do it anymore, But separate was this negative, cynical, depersonalizing, dehumanizing, treating people more as objects than as human beings, the infarction in room 203 rather than Mrs. Jones, that kind of thing. Feeling negative about the working, having to do, and the kind of work you had to do with these people. And then separate from all of those was how you felt about yourself in terms of your own competence and efficacy in the job. So the things didn't all hang together as a single thing. They were correlated, but not high enough to sort of say, oh, we'll just squish it into one single score and that'll be enough. It has these three components. And as the measure got used and translated and used in other parts of the world and other countries and so forth, the same three kind of subcomponents kept coming up. They're interrelated, that's for sure. Do they develop in different sequences? We haven't got all the answers to that. But in some sense, what we're saying is that when people are really experiencing the full thing of burnout, it's not just the stress alone and the tiredness, but it's this negative, for me, almost the hallmark is the negative response to the job. Take this job and shove it. It's a song by Johnny Paycheck.
The first burnout researcher.
There you go. Or, you can get Dolly Parton 9 to 5. I mean, maybe there's another song in there. It's not just they're feeling negative, but the quality of their work is declining. That's what's really important. The measure, although it's been used for a lot of research, and it was 40 years worth, I think, of that research that World Health Organization reviewed in order to come up with their statement about it, that people have often complained about, 3 scores that come out on that. Can't we just have one item? Can't we just change the measure? Can't we just have a single, kind of item and stuff like that? And often those changes to the measure, or they come up with something else, means that there's also stuff out there that may not be as valid as people claim because they've been trying to assess it in a different way.
But I'll tell you, there was one study that you did that I really admire the statistical analysis, which is that it was a statistical analysis that showed that there was a clustering of these experiences, which is that exhaustion, for instance, would show up independently as its own cluster from these other two. And so I want to reiterate what the three are, which is one is feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion. The second one is increased mental distance from one's job, or feelings of negativism or cynicism related to one's job. And the third one is reduced professional efficacy. And I can see how they might influence the other, which is that if I feel like I have reduced professional efficacy, it might increase my mental distance from my job. But they showed up as very, very independent measures, but taken together, they result in really the definition of burnout. And importantly, it's a research measure, so it's not something that shows up in the DSM-6 or whatever version we're on at this point. So it doesn't show up as a diagnosis, but it still shows up in World Health's ICD, partially because of your work, the International Compendium of Diseases, but they related in association to work.
Yeah. And they made it very clear. I mean, when they first announced it, there was a real buzz of misinterpretation, which World Health had to come out and correct it real quickly. Because people were saying, oh, it's a disease because it's in this thing of disease. And they said, no, it's an occupational phenomenon, an experience that can have health consequences. I mean, for years, we were always talking about type A personality and people who have heart attacks. There was this thing about why are these young men having heart attacks at the age of 40? Is these stressful jobs, kind of thing. So this is in that ballpark of, stress responses and what the negative consequences can be beyond the physical health, mental health, but also job performance. And for me, it's really the psychological and social well-being of people. So that's where, when we get into this notion of a fit or a match between the job and the person, we've known about that for a long time in terms of physical match or physical fit. You have the right chair, the right computer station, workstation, so that it doesn't blow out people's wrists and hands, with carpal tunnel, or you have back injuries. I mean, it turns out musculoskeletal injuries are probably the number one work injury that costs, and it's preventable. If you had the right equipment, the right things to support the human body, you're not going to have as much of that. And what we're saying is we also want to look at that social psychological aspect of humans. What makes them tick? What makes them motivated? What makes them take pride in what they're doing? What makes them want to help others, do well as they get along and try to do that? And that gets at sort of these core needs that all of us have throughout life, not just in the workplace, but at home and everywhere we go, of wanting to have some autonomy, some belongingness, psychological safety, as well as physical fairness, and et cetera. And so, again, that's really getting at that sort of notion of what is the environment surrounding people in terms of the problems that they may be having, and how do we better understand that as well as what's happening to them.
Throughout your new book, The Burnout Challenge, you use the metaphor of a canary in a coal mine. Why is that the perfect metaphor?
I think it's a perfect metaphor because it encapsulates the notion of a healthy living creature going into an environment and then becoming unhealthy and having problems, health problems. And what we don't do is tell the canary to take a long weekend or to toughen up and man up and get resilient. Why don't we get a better bird than a canary? It can take it all. The canary is a way of telling us there may be some dangers ahead. There is things there that could put people at risk. And before the miners go down in the mine, whatever that is in terms of the fumes and so forth, that needs to be corrected. It's not about the individual. It's the individual responding to something that's important and then can be changed, that can be improved, so that the environment is healthier for anybody who's going into it to work. Burnout, for me, actually is like a warning sign. It's like a red flag warning. Rather than saying, gee, we've got some incompetent people or people with a problem or, whatever, they may be the early birds, so to speak, to tell you that this is not the best environment for people to be working in. The warning is about the environment. And that environment is the thing that we have not been paying as much attention to, but need to, because it's part of the whole equation. And it's not enough. In fact, it's a good thing to help people cope with stressors, figure out better ways to take care of themselves and so forth. But that doesn't mean that the problem lies within them. The causes, if we don't ask who is burning out, if we ask why are they burning out and focus on what is causing it, we also have to look at how do you manage those stressors better. And the warning is saying there's something going on here, that people are saying, I quit, I leave, I'm not doing good work, they're making mistakes, they're out on absent from work, don't show up or something. What's going on there? And can we begin to modify those stressors so that we sort of reduce the risk of the problem, prevent as many people from having that stress as well? And that's been a harder message to get out, because we, despite years of research and all of this kind of thing, people always are focusing on self-care. What's wrong with the person? There's a disease. There's something wrong with that person, and we just have to help them, fire them, do something about them. And it's not as much looking at the other part of the issue, which is, why is it happening in the first place? And can you do something to make it happen less often?
Yeah, I think that there is a narrative that you hear sometimes, which is that, what about kids these days? They don't have grit like we used to, and maybe they should just man up.
Man up.
And what is interesting about that is that it's so easy to misunderstand the situation that other people are in. And so this is largely a show about how we might design work better. And so what I want to do is I want to start going through some of the things that you've identified that cause burnout, and take those as design questions along the way. And some of them, I think, make a lot of intuitive sense. So one of them is work overload. So hours, emotional burden, which we've talked about some, and skills mismatch. That is intuitive to me, which is that if I'm not skilled at something, it's just harder for me to do it. I worked under a quota for a while. And when I first started, making quota was really, really hard. It took like 10 hours a day. And then as I got more skilled, it took, 6 hours a day.
Right.
But this next one is less intuitive, and it's got a lot of pieces to it, and it's lack of control. So let's part that out a little bit. What are the elements of lack of control?
It can show up in many ways. It means you have, usually in some way, you have no voice in what it is you do, and ways to improvement, ideas about how we could do this better, or we could get rid of something that really isn't necessary or something like that, falls on deaf ears. People don't want to hear about it. That's just complaining and so forth. Even if you're well trained to do the job and you see some ways in which things could be done, you never ever get asked for input. You were just told what to do and you just have to do that. You don't have the ability, you're not given the ability to use your discretion, to use some choice. Suppose something comes up that was unplanned or unexpected and you're going to have to kind of course correct at the moment to deal with that. Do you have that kind of autonomy and ability to make it better or to do something new and try something out? So the demand control model of job stress, which predates my work by, quite some time, recognized that it was not just what the demands are and that there's too much being asked and not enough time and tools and equipment and training and all the rest to do it, but that another important element of all of this was how much actual control, autonomy, discretion you can use as you carry out your work was an important element. So people could have high demands, but if they had high control, they weren't showing the same kind of stress response. And often when we talk to people, especially during the pandemic, workload is the one everybody talks about. Too much to do, the work is hard, et cetera, et cetera. But often when they were talking about it, it was that it was uncontrollable workload. And so the control issue was really more of the one that you had no say in what was happening. And sometimes things were going from not so good to much worse. And people if you think of the early days of the pandemic and how people in healthcare were struggling with, not having protective gear, not knowing exactly what they were going to have to do and deal with all of this, it was really a very difficult kind of thing. Or people's jobs suddenly were changed, because of the pandemic. It's an important thing. And again, it gets into that basic need that all people have for some kind of autonomy as they grow and develop and live their life. I can't tell you how often people have said, I know this job, I know how to do it, but I keep getting told to do something else and it's demoralizing. It's like I'm being treated like a child. So that's part of that thing. It's not that I can't do the job, but that I'm not feeling like I'm contributing and I have a way of making it better and take pride in what I'm doing.
There's a whole lot of components of lack of control that you described in the book. I want to go through some of them because they're different from each other in some ways. It's like it's not a list of similar things. It's a list of different things. So one of them is micromanagement, what you were just talking about, incompetent leaders, ineffective teams, lack of autonomy, exclusion from critical decisions relevant to their work. I thought that was a really interesting one, which is I know how to do my job. I have an opinion about the direction we should go. I'm not involved in the decisions that are affecting my life. That's a part of the lack of control. Feeling ignored, limited, manipulated, distrusted, or undermined. Fear of punishment and being shut out from innovation, which is I could make this better and I'm not being given the opportunity to do that.
Right.
Fear of punishment, how does it relate to lack of control? I guess because I'm fenced in by punishment.
Yeah. That if you do something that even tries to make it better or, work more effectively or something like that, you may be punished for, not going by the rules, or you didn't have the authority to do something, so you had to get an approval first or something like that. And The other thing I just wanted to point out is that when we talk about the 6 areas, and workload and control are 2 of them, these 6 areas sometimes overlap. I mean, you've got like both together, like we were talking about uncontrollable workload. And some of the things that you were talking about there is where you have a lack of control as part of a difficult workplace community. So, in other words, there's those interpersonal things where you're not being trusted, you're not being given support, the fear of punishment from higher ups, or the fear of being bullied or treated badly, by colleagues. It kind of involves both sort of control and community issues kind of together, just like the workload and the control issues together. So I think it's important to realize that those 6 areas, they're starting points, but in fact, sometimes they can involve more than one. That's something that I think is important, because some of those things with the lack of control, where you're feeling you're not in charge of, or you don't have the authority to do something better, or make changes, is often also the relationship you have with your manager, or supervisor, or somebody else, or other people on your team.
I want to dig into one of those categories that you were just describing, which is breakdown in community. There's an always-on culture of fear, cutthroat competition between team members, a word I've never heard before, horizontal violence. What is that?
That's from some other research, which really is trying to unpack and understand why sometimes your colleague, your coworker, who probably understands what you're going through better than anybody, because they're doing the same thing, can be your best friend and can be also your worst enemy at the same time. And we see this happen in many instances of, for example, my colleague and co-author, actually Michael Leiter, has done a lot of research on these kinds of issues. He looks at it under the issues of civility, but what he was doing was research with nurses in Canadian hospitals. Researchers looking at that issue started calling it horizontal violence, that in the sense that it was not going towards, people lower down or higher up. It was going towards people like you, your colleagues, and trying to understand why, if you are feeling frustrated or, held back or having a bad day, that you take it out on somebody else who's like you. Michael was seeing this, among nurses, and developing an intervention around civility that nurses had helped to design. But I was seeing it earlier with another student, graduate student, in people who were working for social issues, people who are involved in things like on climate change, or, reducing violence and all that kind of thing. And they're at times working so hard and and why aren't somebody else here doing some of what I'm doing? And so it was being directed sideways, towards the people that you were working with. So yeah, it was a new concept, a new way of talking about it in terms of the more recent research. What it means then is that people then have a workplace in which they're getting negative feedback, not just from patients, or clients or their bosses or, whatever, but from their colleagues as well. And it's an environment, social environment, community that just becomes negative and unpleasant. And after a while, it just wears you away. You're saying, I don't want to have to live like this anymore. When I did my early interviews, I would often ask people tell me about a good day. Tell me about a bad day. What are the sorts of things that are happening? And for many of these people who were talking about the burnout they were experiencing, a good day was nothing bad happened. That was it. Not that good things happen, but nothing bad happened, which means most of the time there are screamers, there are crises, there are unpleasantcies, and, you just get through it. And a good day, nobody complains. There's no screamers, but it's not like, oh, we've accomplished, some wonderful thing and so forth.
So then there's the absence of fairness, favoritism, unjust decisions, discrimination, being excluded from full membership in the community, exploitation. One of the things that you noted in the book is that absence of fairness is highly related to cynicism, which is interesting because you look at this, we've already got a job here that is like, if I was going to make a job description for this job, this is a job where I'm going to work too much. I'm going to be exposed to caring in a highly emotionally charged situation where I might feel empathy toward people who are sick or ill, or I don't have control, I've micromanaged, I can't fix it because I can't innovate. We haven't talked about it, but there's insufficient rewards, financial, social, emotional. I don't have any support because I'm all alone because I don't have a community. But here, under absence of fairness, is where cynicism first came into the description. It seems like the absence of fairness could be a perception, and it could be real, and it could not be real. But it doesn't matter if the perception is there. Is that correct?
I think so, because if people feel that they are being treated unfairly and feel that somehow, no matter what they do, how hard they work, whatever they do, they're not getting recognized in a way, rewarded, positive feedback, but they're not getting a new opportunity, maybe a better job, a promotion, desk by the window, various kinds of things. And people will act on that perception, even if people say, well, but maybe it's not really that they're being treated unfairly. Well, but why don't they know what the sort of the fair procedure is? This is where we have that phrase, glass ceilings. You can see where it's possible to go, but somehow you're not being given the opportunities to move through that. And in some cases, it's, I think, more clear what some of the things are. So the little example that we gave in the book about this was with an organization we were working with and collecting data over time longitudinally. And when we talked to the CEO about, well, when we first get the first set of data on these 6 areas, which do you think are going to be the problematic ones? And he said, oh, well, it's going to be workload because everybody complains they're working too much. And it's going to be reward because they don't think they're getting paid enough. That's the complaints. And that's probably where they're going. We got the data. Workload and reward were not problematic at all. What was problematic was fairness. And he was really shocked. I mean, what? Fairness? People think this is not a fair place to work, da, 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 da. Well, it turned out when you started going through it and looking at it, there were all kinds of things that people complained about as not being fair. But the one we sort of focused on was the one for which there was almost like universal agreement that a distinguished service award was really, really, really unfair. People hated that award. They were even heard that they might be nominated. They didn't want anybody to know about it because it was such a negative stigma. I mean, it was just like you could see the venom dripping when they talked about it. And it was not, and at first his response was, well, maybe we need to give a bigger monetary bonus for that award. Maybe that's it. And I said, it's not a reward issue. It's a fairness issue. People thought it went to the wrong people. It was rigged somehow to go to the people who didn't deserve it. And the people who did deserve it had done something special and, went far and beyond or come up with something really good. Never, ever got that award. And he was saying, I never saw it coming. So he set up a process saying, I'm not the one to do it. I want you to help me figure out how we can do a fair process, for an award that will recognize people who've done something special. And there were like 50 ways in which you could be unfair. It's you give the award to the leader of a team and the team who did the work doesn't get the award. Somebody didn't get a promotion, so their supervisor says, oh, never mind, I'll get you the award. On and on and on and on. So they had a whole task force. They worked on it. They came up with, it was not easy, but they finally came up with a better process and the company agreed to do it. And when we went back later, that issue had kind of dropped down to, hey, we're okay now, that kind of thing. But you could see early on how it's an award that goes out occasionally to somebody, but it just stuck in people's craw, of how bad it was. And that it sort of signaled that there's stuff going on that means that there's not a fair way of evaluating who's doing good work and how they might move forward. And so I think that's where the cynicism comes from. Like, you can't trust this because this stuff is going on. You've got other people who are getting ahead, not because they deserve it, but because they're buttering up the boss, and all kinds of things like that. I remember once earlier when I had gathered data on this and said, it looks like all of you really dislike this Distinguished Service Award. I got an ovation from the audience of the participants, not because of anything I said per se, but because I was acknowledging what they all felt, which was, this is crap. and it's just going to the wrong people, and it just undermines trust and other kind of things. But their fixing that actually gave them hope and optimism that they could tackle other problems in the workplace. And so they set up their own process based on what we had gone through in the research with them. And they've been carrying it on to this day, as a regular annual or biannual, let's hear it. What could we do that would, fix another pebble in our shoe?
That's really, really fascinating. I got one of those big awards once. And in retrospect, this was at a previous company. In retrospect, it was largely because I was providing direct value to leadership. In other words, they could see what I was doing because it was value they were receiving. But there's a million people who were providing enormous value to the company that was just much less legible to the leadership. And it was very exclusive. I'm sure it did create a great deal of harm. That's fascinating. What you assume is that it's going to create something that people can strive toward.
Yeah.
Like an Emmy.
Well, but it's interesting. I mean, during the pandemic, people at my university, Berkeley, and other places had to switch the way they taught. Whether they had tried doing online before or not, everybody had to be in a different place and had to learn on the fly, fixing the plane while you're flying it, kind of thing. And it was a lot of work and a lot of effort and constantly trying to figure out how you dealt with a new problem and the students wanting to, get feedback instantly, morning, noon, and night. At one of these, there was an announcement of a special teaching award for somebody who had really done something special in this thing. And there was an eruption among a lot of people saying, making one person be the one who gets awarded is like a slap in the face to everybody else who really ground it out and managed to do a good job. Why not thank everybody or do something special for everyone who got through successfully? The notion that one person who gets the award will inspire everybody else to do it is not actually seen a lot, kind of thing. And there's a sense in which the power of recognition, which is in the area of reward, you can have salary benefits, et cetera. But we have found in the research that the recognition by other people of something that you've done well carries a lot more weight, feels more sincere and authentic, and it can means a lot to people in terms of what they're going to do and how they go forward. Somebody notices. This is why I think walk around leadership is sometimes so powerful, because you're actually getting to know the people, recognize them by name, can see what's happening. It's like, oh, so that's why you've been asking for that new equipment. Oh, I got it now, et cetera. It's not just reward. It's a positive feedback mechanism. You do something that's good, that contributes, that makes a difference. And there's something that happens, even if it's somebody just patting you on the back and saying, wow, really saved that deal with that client. I might not have handled it so well. So,
Middle management's a really tough job. Line management's a really tough job. We asked people, if you would like to say something positive about your manager, just put it here anonymously. In a management meeting, and this was a lot of managers, we played it back. I mean, it was just the quotes of what people appreciated from their direct manager. People were crying. It was one of the most important things that had happened in a long, long time, because they hadn't heard that. And just to hear, say, look, my manager really supported me through my mother's death, or, these things. And it was emotional. It was a big deal.
I can believe it. Wow. And it's interesting because I worry sometimes about what happens when somebody becomes a manager. I mean, we know this from a lot of people, is that you're working with everybody else on whatever the job X is, and then somebody is selected to be the manager of that group. Suddenly, you don't have the same kind of communication. You don't have the same kind of trust. It's like you're a wolf in sheep's clothing and you're not one of the sheep anymore. So there are these things that get in the way of actually having that kind of communication actually expressed directly in some way.
Well, and if it's expressed directly and not anonymously, it's harder to trust. But if it's expressed anonymously and shared anonymously, I think it's got real power. I want to talk about values conflicts, job requirements that clash with moral principles, and being compelled to do things that you consider unethical. And there's a phrase here, soul erosion. What does that mean?
it's a phrase that I would hear often in interviews, that the job is eroding my soul. So the term erosion comes up a lot in the interviews. And when people talk about this, it's like I was able to start off and do the job, but it's like those chronic job stressors that, everything, it's erosive. You used to be able to do it well, and now you don't, or you take shortcuts, or you're not pleased or happy about it, but it's harder to get up and look at yourself in the mirror in the morning. So that notion of a gradual erosion of being able to do my job, but in particular, it would be used to talk about the erosion of my soul. And it was kind of intriguing to me to hear that, and so often. So that was why I was keeping it in there. And basically saying at some point, the job is stripping me of what I consider most important and valuable in my life and what I'm doing. And I can't keep doing this anymore. So if you remember in the book, there was a story that I had put in about a doctor who had worked in Afghanistan, in the emergency, surgery and stuff, which had been an incredible, despite the horror of all of that, a high point in her career and being able to, do this kind of work. She came back, had an appointment in a major hospital, and burned out. And I think one of the things, it wasn't that she was working too hard or something like that, but she felt that the basic reason she was doing the kind of work the hospital asked her to do was just to make more money for the hospital. And it was not about actually the value that she was giving to the patients and the kind of people, and the kind of, work that she could do, the surgery that she could do. And she was just feeling like a worker bee who it just didn't really matter. And she was just saying, I just hated getting up in the morning and going to work. So she was really talking about the values of why I went into medicine, why this is important to me. And so she quit and took another job, and it was at less salary. And it was in a pediatric hospital where she was working with, young children. And it was like, this is why I went into medicine. So it was not about making as much money as I can make, but it was like, did I do a job where what I am able to contribute and is what I've been trained to do, in this case, help children, not just the soldiers before. And I'm valued and respected for that. And it made all the difference for her. And so I think in many cases, when people feel these value conflicts, that what I have to do to sort of lie, cheat, and steal or something like that is just not, I can't do it anymore. They often will say things like, it's eroding my soul and it's not worth giving up my soul for money or, anything like this. I need to go to a place where I feel I'm doing something that I truly take pride in, that is important to me, that is meaningful to me, that there is purpose of what I do.
It's an interesting story to me because I would think that being in Afghanistan as a medic would be the burnout source of all, the greatest source. But because the mission was a valuable mission to this medic, she really felt that it was a place that she could thrive. But as soon as she was in a for-profit situation and felt like the purpose of her work, and I'm sure this is happening more and more in medicine. If you talk to people in medicine 20 years ago, you would have found less values conflict, or 30 years ago anyway, than you do today, just because of the financial constraints. And I know I see it in teaching. I see a combination of things in people who are teaching, which is micromanagement by legislation, which is a particularly challenging kind of micromanagement because it's so distant from the work itself. And then what a part of that micromanagement is that they have to spend an enormous amount of their time doing paperwork, which is really just surveillance. The paperwork does not have that much to do with teaching kids, which is why they're there. That's the value that they get out of it. And so I did not go into teaching to spend all my time enabling my own surveillance.
And there's even, I think we use it somewhere in the book, there's a sense in which some of that work that you have to do is required now, is legislated, is mandated. It feels like what's termed illegitimate work. That in other words, you're being forced to do things that are really not the basic core of your work, which is teaching or medical care or, whatever. But you have to do all of this other, often paperwork. And interestingly, people talk about, being in a situation where managers are more on them to make sure they're getting the paperwork done, then spending time with their students, spending time with their patients. Doctors complain, physicians complain about the electronic medical record as all this, again, kind of paperwork, but on, electronic, as bottom of their license, as opposed to top of their license, which is spending time with the patients, or, more time than they're given or something like that. So there's people who've done research on this kind of thing where some of the burnout is coming not because of the actual work that you're doing with whoever, but with all of this other stuff that has gotten piled on and takes up time and just makes you not feel great about what you've accomplished every workday. Cuts into your family time, cuts into your lunchtime or your break time at work. I mean, I've seen people where you never get together anymore because you're spending all this time catching up with all of this other stuff that needs to be done.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things about both professions, but the teaching profession, which I see into a lot because my wife is a teacher and my daughter's a teacher.
Ah, okay.
Which is, my friends who teach education up at the university are seeing half as many people enroll right now in credentialing programs. And so the challenge is that people think it's about pay, which is that if we could just legislate more pay, well, that's probably true. It would help. But it's also true that if you could eliminate the administrivia, I love the phrase that you use in the book, which is doctors and nurses saying that they want to work at the top of their license, which is the highest value work that they can do, not the most trivial work that they can do.
Exactly.
And so in terms of designing work, there's always this question I have, which is when we look at what makes work bad, that's not the same thing as the opposite of what makes work good. So, and the analogy that I use is that if I'm a chef and I'm really, really good at not giving you food poisoning, that does not mean I'm really, really good at making a souffle. I can't make a fantastic meal by not giving you food poisoning. So is it a continuum? If we did the opposite of the things that create burnout, would we create thrivance?
Yeah, in a way, but I think it takes more than that. I think what we're trying to say is that if you look at these 6 areas and kind of get an assessment of what's going well, we don't need to bother with that, but where are there areas where we have those pebbles in the shoe, chronic job stressors? Can we begin to come up with, is it happening in a more, we don't have a lot of community support, we're not working well together, there's not much positive feedback, is there a fairness issue? I mean, different kinds of things, but trying to identify a number of possible changes or fixes that would not just do the opposite, but a pivot to say, okay, this is not working. What might be a little bit better? Not perfect, but what would be better than what we're struggling with right now? How could we better do intake or special meetings that, we have with each student or each, client or something like that? Can we come up with as many different ways of, do we rotate who does the intake? Do we change what questions we ask? Is there some better way of informing people when they might come in? And just, there's a string of things to begin to think about. And that's why I like the pebbles in the shoe analogy that is often used, because it makes it clear that the scope is more lower, doable things that impact you on a chronic daily basis kind of thing. And if we could make a few little changes that would actually get rid of something or make it less frequent. And that's why that little fairness example was a one of, they fixed this award process to make it a more fair award that people enjoyed and were proud of, and it gave access to more people to get it. But what it did, it inspired people to say, when we came back and talked to them later, well, if we could fix that, maybe there's this other thing over here that doesn't work so well and everybody complains about, and we could fix that. So there was a little bit of hope. There was optimism. We could do this, and we can do it under the radar of, the top management, because it only is relevant for our unit, kind of thing. Something that says that periodically on our agenda is, how could we make things a little bit better here? And do the 6 areas give us some initial starting points to identify where are some of those chronic stressors that are those worrisome, annoying pebbles in the shoe, and actually try it out until we get it right. and make it better. And maybe next year we try something else because the world will change and we'll have other things facing us. So it should be sort of a continuous process, not a one size fits all, then we're done kind of thing.
It makes a lot of sense, especially this idea that it's a chronic problem requires a chronic solution. You can't, this is a weird way to say it, but you can't make an acute solution to a chronic problem. You need a chronic solution to a chronic problem.
You do. And that's why when I've heard of people who are running organizations like the last few months, they're saying, well, maybe we'll just shut down, the business for the week and we'll all take a break and a vacation and then people will come back and that'll be the end of burnout. And I'm saying, no. I mean, you can have a respite, a vacation. It depends what you do on the vacation, et cetera, et cetera. But if you come back to the same chronic stressors, it's going to just start up all over again. So that's a temporary quick fix, you think, but it may not actually work for the long haul.
So there's a question I often ask at the end of these, which is that because I see work as a design challenge, I use design tools to learn what people want from work. And one of the questions I always ask is, what job do you hire your work to do for you? If I wanted to design a better drill, I would ask somebody, I could ask them how to design the drill, and they'd say, well, it needs to have a little trigger right here. Or I could ask them, what do you want to get done? What job do you want to do with that drill? And they'd say, I want to make a hole in the wall. You say, well, if you can make a hole in the wall without the trigger, would that be okay? They say, yeah, that's fine. And if you have the little trigger, but you can't put a hole in the wall, would that be okay? They say, no, that's not a drill. That's not what I want at all. So by asking what people want from a product, it's a way to understand how you might design it better. And so it's just a part of my closing. But I will tell you that in your case, it's particularly interesting, which is that you're a professor emeritus, which means you don't have to work.
That's true.
And yet you're working. And so when I ask you the question, what job do you hire your job to do for you? It's not for the pay. Why are you working?
Yeah. I think you work, obviously there's a practical sort of thing. You need to support yourself and your life and whatever, and you need to get the resources to do that and earn money. But you work, ideally, you work at something that gives you a lot of meaning and inspiration, and it's something you enjoy doing. So I think the things you look for are what are the things I need in order to do the job as the best I can. And so if I'm teaching a class of 500 students, then what kind of room am I going to get? What kind of technical support am I going to get so that I can be heard, that I can be seen, that I can put images up? If I'm going to match the lecture with smaller sections, then I need to hire a bunch of graduate students as teaching assistants who I then work with to design weekly sessions and, what kind of things are we going to try and do, and give them material, and we talk it through so that they're prepared to do those sessions, to work with them as we talk about the grading for, the different things. So and the institution kind of then sort of supports the fact that if I'm teaching that many students, I do get people who can help me with the teaching and giving feedback and working on, how do we assess the students' progress? How do we help them learn?
It's an interesting answer, by the way. I've never heard it quite said that way. The closest I get is people who say, I hire my job to make things. I hire my job to build things. In other words, I want to be given projects that I can build. And when you dig into that, you hear them say, well, I want a tool shed. I want the tools to do my job. And I want the materials, and I want a project. They want, just give me a workshop, basically. But you said it about something that's not about making, which is you said, I hire my job, essentially, I'm going to paraphrase, to give me the tools of my trade, to supply the tools of my trade, which require infrastructure, which require staff. I want to have an effect on the world, which is I'm making this change, and I need the tools of my trade to do it.
Yeah.
I like that. And I often ask the question, what does your job cost you? But I'll tell you, I think that you've actually compiled the definitive list of what people's jobs cost them, which is that when your job costs you too much, the result is burnout.
Yeah. And you either have to find ways in which you can change the situation or change yourself and the situation to get better and a better fit, or match there, or you need to get out and go into another place, which is going to work better for you and the circumstances you're in. It's interesting in terms of your thing about teaching as well, that I used to serve on a board of a company, a publishing company down in Silicon Valley, and ran into the HR person and was talking with her recently. And it was always hard whenever we posted a job opening because we were competing with Silicon Valley. They, and different companies could pay a lot more than we could, and how to get somebody who was really good for the job and, so forth. And she said they had posted a new job, and she said, you won't believe the number of people, good qualified people who've applied for this job. I said, wow. And is there anything about them that is the characteristics of the group that you have that has applied? And she said, well, unbelievably, there's a whole lot of teachers lining up for this job in the publishing company. And when you think about it, they have the skills and a different kind of thing in terms of writing, reading, communicating, educating, all that kind of stuff. And they were obviously all saying, I think I could do this job instead. I'm not going back to the school.
Right. My daughter left teaching recently. And I'll tell you what's interesting is that because I've interviewed so many people asking them, what does your job cost you? And I suspect if I go back through those, I'm going to be able to classify them using your system of the sources of burnout in most cases. There's one that I don't hear, which is one of the costs of my job is opportunity cost, which is there's other great jobs I could do. In other words, it's that there are things that I could be doing.
Yeah. But didn't the pandemic open the door a bit on that? Because before that, it was always, the job is what it is. If you can't take the heat, get out of the kitchen sort of thing. If there's a gap, you've got to fill it. But suddenly we had to do work differently, whether we liked it or not, whether we chose good solutions or not. And we can learn from the mistakes that were made, but we can also learn from the fact that people then said, I don't have to assume that I have to commute to do a job. Maybe there's other things in other places. It just opened it up for possibilities, I think. And I think some of that great resignation kind of talk was not so much just leaving the job, but saying there might be other things out there that I'd never considered before, and maybe I should try. I don't know.
One of the things that I talk about on the show sometimes is I believe employees are customers, and I believe that they are companies sell them a product or a service, which is called work. And so that's why I take work as a product that we should study that way. But one of the things about being a customer is the word customer comes originally from the word custom, which was habit. It was the people whose habit it was to come to your store. And habits are a remarkably fragile thing in some cases, which is I used to go to this coffee shop all the time. And then they were closed one day because they were remodeling. And so I tried another coffee shop. I like the other coffee shop better now. So in one disruption of habit, I was no longer in the habit of going to that coffee shop. And there's been a disruption of habit with the pandemic. And it's really destabilized a lot of assumptions. And all of a sudden people stand back. 60% of the people who left their jobs last year left without another job lined up.
That's amazing.
Well, thank you for coming on the show. This really has filled a gap, I think, in the catalog of the show. Really have not had a chance to talk to somebody as knowledgeable and deeply scholarly about the harms of work. And so I really appreciate you coming and talking to us.
I appreciate that. And I'd also like to say, I believe work can always be better. So maybe there's harms, but for me, the important thing is how do we learn from that and say, what do we do next that might actually improve things? People want to accomplish something and leave a mark and feel like they're living a good life while they're doing good stuff. I think there are more ways that we could make that a better experience for more people for the time they have on this planet. So there's a positive thing.
Right. And such a huge proportion of the time that people have on the planet.
Yeah. And it's wanting to get the best out of people, and they want to do the best. I mean, I think that's a basic motivation. I mean, when you get to the point where you don't, it's really sad. And I some of my interviews, by the way, have been with teachers who were fabulous, fabulous teachers, and to see them go because of this was just heartbreaking. So much potential, so much good stuff that was happening, and how did we lose that? It's not good.
Where can people learn more about your work?
I hope by reading the book, because this has been trying to pull things together after many decades of research and sort of say, here's what seems to be the way to think about this, to operate and so forth. I think it's important because it provides a summary, and it provides a summary in trying to make it in a more common language than sort of academies, journals, so that everybody has, whether you're an employee or you're a manager or a boss or a customer or a client, you can understand, can be on the same page, I hope, on understanding this and actually move us in a more positive direction to get the workplaces and the people in them all thriving and doing well.
And so just to remind people, the name of the book is The Burnout Challenge, and it's by Christina Maslach and Michael P. Leiter, spelled Leiter. Thank you for coming on the show.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's been really fun.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio, for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.